This presentation is entitled Songs of Life and Mind. I just want to get the ideas out. I need to say them, I need to put them out. It's about using multi-scale harmonic resonance, or songs, to unify a new way of looking at development, evolution, and agency. And a sort of in-house working title might be Taking the Music of Life metaphor seriously. It's a collection of ideas that hang together around those themes, and it's speculative. It builds on work which is published: How Can Evolution Learn? The Notes on Agency, Part-Whole Relationships, and Individuality, and also the Deep Optimization Algorithm by Jamie Caldwell. And it's collaborative work with Mike Levin and his ideas about mind everywhere, Darwin's agential materials, and multi-scale autonomy, and the work that we've done together on transitions in agency, adaptation by natural induction, collective intelligence, and a design for an individual paper. Which is just to say, there are some foundations that are published, but the ideas here are new. So the motivating questions are: what are living things? Where is the design information held? Where does the design information come from? What makes it all so smart? Who's in charge here, and what does it all mean? Well, we know the answers to these questions. All biological complexity is determined by genetic information put there by natural selection. The information is held in the genes. It's put there by the process of birth, death at the organismic level that selects for particular genetic variants. The genes are in control of producing the phenotype of organisms. And it isn't smart. It's an uninformed process. The genes are in charge of the biology, and natural selection is in charge of the genes. And what does it all mean? Well, it means that the prime mover is differential survival and reproduction, a competitive model, intrinsically competitive model. Or if you prefer, it doesn't mean anything. It's just what happens. Here are some analogous questions about mind. What are mental states, thoughts, and ideas? Where are they held? Where does mental information come from? Well, we know the answer to that. All mental complexity is determined by neural information that's put there by learning. The information is in the connections between the neurons, and the learning mechanism is a feedback process of reward that modifies those connections based on the outcomes of our behaviors. The neurons are in control of what we do. My brain makes me do it. What makes it so smart? Well, in a sense, maybe it isn't that smart. It's just, electrical impulses firing from one neuron to another, and changes in those connections are just a simple reward feedback mechanism. Who's in charge? Well, the neurons are. We're all material reductionists. And what does it all mean? Well, we're some sort of biological machine, or if you like, it doesn't mean anything. It's just what happens. All of the information is put into the neural network by the learning process. I've used a picture of Donald Hebb to represent a theory about how that might work. Except the stuff that's put there by natural selection, the stuff that's innate in our brains. And all of the machinery of the learning process, the capacity to learn, comes from natural selection, we presume. So, are there any connecting questions between life and mind? Is there any relationship between the mechanisms of life and the mechanisms of mind? Well, a first stab might be, well, learning is a kind of selection in the head, as though we generate hypotheses or ideas, and the ones which are consistent with observations survive, and the ones which aren't don't. But that new scale, that nested internal scale of selection, is a mechanism created by the original organismic level of natural selection. That's one reasonably popular hypothesis about how thoughts and minds work. Another possibility is that what's going on in the head isn't really like natural selection. It's something cleverer than trial and error, but it is nonetheless still a product of the selection process at the organismic level, which was itself not clever. So here's a thought. What if it was the other way around? Can we entertain a learning first account of living systems? So I mentioned that we're comfortable with the idea that mind might be a natural selection process going on in the head, that one level of selection can therefore create another level of selection. Could it be possible that one level of learning creates another level of learning so that we have nested learning processes instead of nested selection processes? And we were okay with the idea that natural selection might sometimes create learning mechanisms which are different from the learning mechanism you started with. We were comfortable with the idea that natural selection might sometimes create learning mechanisms which are different from the selection mechanism you started with. So could it be the case that a learning mechanism could create another learning mechanism that's different from the learning mechanism that it started with? For example, can a learning mechanism create natural selection? Well, if we were going to turn things around like that, we would need a new theory. We would need a theory of spontaneous learning instead of starting with a theory of selection. Now, hold on a minute. Aren't learning and selection the same anyway? Aren't these just different words for the same kind of adaptive process? Some would suggest that selection is a kind of gradient process, that the mean of a population climbs local gradients in a fitness landscape, for example. It's all about following gradients. And conversely, learning is a kind of trial and error search process. So it's all selection. These are just different words for the same kind of thing. But if they are really the same kind of thing, then saying it's all selection and saying it's all learning would actually be the same statements. But do they have the same implications? If I was to say it's learning all the way down, does that mean the same to you as if I say it's selection all the way down? The conventional story is that it's selection all the way down, meaning it was selection first, and learning is a special thing that selection creates sometimes, which may or may not be exactly the same as selection anyway. But if I say it's learning all the way down and it started with learning, that feels a little uncomfortable. So are they the same or not? Are you really comfortable with saying that they're identical? I think the real issue here is whether you think that the process, one of these processes is smart and another of these processes is dumb. And whether it's okay to start with a process that's smart or whether you have to start with a process that's dumb. Let me expand on that a little bit. In artificial intelligence, we have a concept of the knowledge versus search trade-off. If you don't know what you're doing, then you have to try things at random. You have to explore the space of possibilities in an uninformed way until you get what you want. That's a search process. If you do know what you're doing, then you don't have to do that. You don't have to try things at random until you find what you want. You just know what to do already and you just do it. Knowledge is the smart way and search is the dumb way. Now, in natural selection, built out of physical stuff, the contrast between natural selection and ordinary physical stuff is that physical stuff just goes where it goes. It just goes where it's pushed. It falls downhill. Whereas natural selection seems to try out lots of different things and keep the things that work. And in this way of viewing things, we think that selection is the clever thing and physical systems that just go where they go are the dumb thing. That's a contrast that is kind of interesting as we switch these around from thinking about learning first or natural selection first. The real issue is whether we started with something clever or started with something dumb. Or put differently, what we really mean by clever is that you have foresight, that the direction that you're going to go, whilst it might not require any search, is special. whereas in search, the direction that you're going to go doesn't require any foresight. So let's look more closely at the difference between learning and a selection process, a trial and error search process. What kind of a learning process isn't a trial and error search process? Well, if real intelligence is knowing what to do without search, then we're talking about a transformational process rather than a variational process in Sober's terminology. A process of transforming one system into another system rather than picking out variants that already do the right thing from a set of possibilities. In other words, we're talking about a gradient method rather than a search method, something that transforms the state of a system by following gradients rather than searching a combinatorial space and then picking out the ones that work. But if we're talking about a gradient process, then necessary gradients pushed us in the direction that we wanted to go, then it wouldn't be clever because just physics does that, doesn't it? Well, yeah, because physics does everything. But maybe gradients can be nested, and that would make them an interesting kind of physics, rather than just a rolling downhill kind of physics. What would a metagradient be? Now, if we're not careful, this leads to questions like, does physics right down there at the bottom do search or do gradients? Particle wave duality or classical versus quantum interpretations of the universe? And I don't want to worry too much about the metaphysical nature of the universe, but I am going to explore a classical wavy version of life and mind, utilizing the classical analog of quanta, namely resonant wave dynamics. Now, it makes sense that you get close to the metaphysical nature of the universe if you're going to ask questions like, how can learning arise from nothing? Especially when you're thinking recursively about learning to learn, learning to learn, to learn to learn, and so on. That sort of nesting that we were talking about. But, you know, you'll have to bear with me. So, if we had a transformational theory of life and mind rather than a variational one, we would need gradients all the way down, as it were. But they'd have to be interesting ones. How can they be interesting? What's a metagradient process? When is a metagradient process not just a gradient process? It's the same question as when is the evolution of evolvability not just evolution? If you're evolving a genotype-phenotype map, then there's variation on the parameters of your genotype-phenotype map, and you're keeping the ones which were working and not discarding the ones which didn't. So it's just evolution, right? Yeah. So there's a can of worms there, and it's the same can of worms that we're looking at in the concept of a metagradient process. A sneak peek about where we're going with this is the idea of folding a space. So we take a continuous space and we fold it over, and that creates discontinuities, which are interesting discontinuities in the places that we wanted them to be. Yeah, but if it's going to create discontinuities, then the gradient methods won't work. You won't know which way to go if there's discontinuities, and you can't have it both ways again. So there's a question here of how can it be easy, like a gradient process, and be interesting with discontinuities that calculate non-trivial outcomes at the same time? Well, I'm going to tell you what my answer is to that, but it won't make any sense yet. And what we're trying to do in the process of these talks or set of talks is to understand what this means, or for me to try and convey what I mean by this. So the folds are low-dimensional projections of continuous differentiable curves in a high-dimensional space. So there's this high-dimensional space where everything is curvy and continuous. But when you project that high-dimensional space down into a low-dimensional space, you see discontinuities. But they're not really discontinuities in the high-dimensional space. Everything is still curvy. So that means that in the low-dimensional space, it looks like things are strongly constrained, but really it's smooth and transformable. And in that high-dimensional space, we can represent, by turning that high-dimensional space around, we can represent constraints that look like this or constraints that look like that. In fact, all of those different constraints coexist simultaneously depending on which projection you take of the high-dimensional space. like a piece of music with notes that stand in contrast to one another, like they're different things, like there are gaps between them, and yet they all seem to be part of the same space of possibilities, the same key. They fit together. They're part of a higher dimensional object that's being sort of projected into a low dimensional space over time. And the space in which they're in is a space in which they seem to co-create as they go. You play the first note and anything could come next. You play the second note and now you've created an interval, and into that interval other things fit and some other things don't. And then you play the third note and now you know the key that you're in, and it begins to constrain what happens next. But it's a moving object, and as the notes that you've played in the past recede, the dimensionality in the space in which you're working changes. It makes its own way. Shout out to Andrea Hyatt. So this puts us in the territory of a higher order transformational process, a recursion, where we have a transformational process that's transforming a transformational process that's transforming a transformational process. And all of those processes are just falling downhill. They're just going where they go. But at the same time as falling downhill in the ordinary space that looks boring, in the lower dimensional projections, they look smart. They look like a process that knows how to change its knowledge of which way to go, and so on recursively. It's going to be great. You're going to love it. So part one, what's the problem and where are we trying to go? Part two, music of life, organisms are songs, big ideas. Part three, where do songs come from? Natural induction, physics of cognition, songs as a substrate of algorithm and life, and then draw it all together. Okay, so let's start with what are the problems? So what's the problems with a selection first account? Why do we need a new theory of anything? We've already got a theory that's perfectly fine, don't we? So there are three types of problems. One is theoretical limitations. Second is adaptive limitations. And the third is it doesn't match our observations. Now, this is not an exercise in just bashing the current theory. It's an exercise in identifying the directions that we need to move, the frustrations that point the way, the kinds of things that need to be incorporated in a theory that would account for those. Okay, so let's start with the first of those, the theoretical limitation that's created by a self-referential process. So the conventional understanding of the Darwinian machine is that we have a process of variation, selection, and inheritance that produces genetic variants, and we go iterate this process over time. Variation and inheritance are fixed processes. Genetic mutations happen, not because they were part of the process, but just because they just happen. Inheritance is what the crystalline template replication structure of DNA does. And differential selection is, well, that's just that some of those variants survive in the environment and some of them don't. Those are the axiomatic mechanisms of the machine, and the products change over time. The trouble is that the products modify the mechanisms of the machine. Variation, selection, and inheritance are not fixed mechanisms. It's a self-referential process because the product of the Darwinian machine isn't an inert data structure, a string of bits. It's an organism, and the organism plays an active role in the mechanisms of the Darwinian machine. For example, the developmental processes and phenotypic plasticity of the organism modify the distribution of variants that can be produced. The behavior of the organism modifies the kind of inheritance that's possible, even the basic genetic level of inheritance, like some organisms reproduce sexually and some organisms reproduce asexually. That completely changes what the level of inheritance is and the mechanisms of reproduction are. And yeah, I know that those mechanisms were themselves specified in the genes. I said it was recursive, but that's the point. And organisms also modify their selection by being in the environment. They modify the environment. And small mountain-dwelling mammals have webbed feet because they made the lakes in which they live, not because the water was already there, the lake was already there. So the Darwinian machine is self-referential, meaning it modifies its own axiomatic mechanisms. Well, you can't have a theory that modifies its own axioms, can you? No theory can account for modifications of its own axioms. So you need a theory about how the Darwinian machine changes. And the Darwinian machine doesn't do that. It doesn't provide such a theory. It can't, because no theory can explain changes in its own axioms. In other words, what's the meta-program? So already we're beginning to see that organisms are involved in homeostatic feedback loops with their environment at all scales, reaching out into their environment and modifying the conditions in which they find themselves. Those loops are both external to the organism and internal to the organism, inside their mind, if they have one, and inside their body more generally. Those loops exist at many different scales, and the homeostasis of those loops defines the individuality that we observe in nature. Which is to say, individuals are not fixed. Individuals are made of parts that used to be individuals themselves. The truly surprising thing about evolution by natural selection is not that it makes individuals better adapted to their environment, but that it makes individuals. In the primordial soup, we had self-replicating molecules, which joined together to form larger self-replicating entities of chromosomes, which I recently discovered have much more interesting three-dimensional structure than I previously realized. Then there's the prokaryote cells, the simple bacterial cells that contain many chromosomes, the eukaryote cells, which contain many organelles of prokaryote origin, and the multicellular organisms, which contain trillions of eukaryote cells and not some cute ones. Now, these are not just containers. They're not just bags of units from the previous level. Each of these different levels of organization have their own behavior, their own agency. They interact with one another with causal processes at the level that is relevant to their identity, with behaviors that are causal in determining what happens to those entities at that level of organization, and of course, interacting with levels of organization above and below. In other words, individuality involves nested homeostatic loops at different scales of organization, interacting with one another upwards and downwards. Those loops can be ecological, social, neural, bioelectrical, immunological, metabolic networks, gene regulation networks, protein interaction networks, cytoskeletal structures, which are dynamic, and chemical and molecular, including the genes. We don't have a good handle on how these nested homeostatic loops interact with the process of variation and selection. Next, I want to talk about the weakness of natural selection as an adaptive process. Now, I know what you're going to say, but look at all that amazing stuff that natural selection did. Now, I'm going to say, yeah, look at all that amazing stuff that biological evolution did. But the algorithm of natural selection is a weak optimizer, and there's a disconnect there between how weak the optimization method is and how awesome the products of biological evolution are. You can't say, but it isn't a weak optimizer because look at those products, because we're talking about whether or not this process explains those products or not. Anyway, natural selection is an optimization process which at best moves the mean of a population up the local gradient in a fitness landscape according to the selection coefficients that the variants are exposed to. But, well, many people would argue that it doesn't even do that it's just a dynamical process that does whatever it does. But at best, it climbs to a local peak in an adaptive landscape. But only the nearest local optimum in that landscape. This is what we would call a first-order optimizer. It's the kind of optimization that physics does when a ball rolls downhill to the local minimum. In fact, it's exactly the same as that algorithmically. It's not any more clever because we usually conceive of evolution by natural selection as going uphill instead of down. Natural selection is really just the statement that things move in the direction that they're pushed. If the selection coefficients mean that this thing increases in frequency and that thing decreases in frequency, then they do. If the local gradients in an objective function or an energy function determine that these are the gradients that are moving the components of our physical system, then that's where they move. It doesn't say anything different from that. It doesn't say anything about the landscape, how they came to be pushed this way rather than that way. It doesn't say anything about the feedbacks between the evolution of the organism and the shape of the landscape. There isn't anything second order or higher order in the feedbacks between the adaptive process and the conditions of that adaptation and mechanisms of that adaptation. You might say, well, maybe sometimes there is a sort of second order process if we get into higher order selection or multi-level selection, but that requires higher level evolutionary entities to already be there before they can change what happens next. It's not an argument I want to go into here, but it is an area that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. It doesn't say anything about the self-referential homeostatic feedback loops or their nestedness that is intrinsic to the biology. Okay, so the third category of problem is things about the biology that don't seem to fit the model. For example, if it's supposed to be the case that the morphology of an organism is determined by information in the genes, then whilst there might be some phenotypic variation that occasionally is environmentally induced and not in the genes, that's not going to be important to the organism. But gross scale characteristics that do matter to the organism, like its physiology in the gross form, like how many heads it has, that had better be in the genes, otherwise it can't be an adaptation. But it turns out that if you read the bioelectric pattern from the head end of a planarian and write the bioelectric pattern onto the tail end of the planarian, then the tail transforms into a head and you have a two-headed worm. And moreover, when the worm reproduces by fissioning, by ripping in half, both halves grow to be two-headed, and they seem to be doing that for many generations. So that means that the gross scale morphological type of the organism doesn't have to be a genes first change. Here's another interesting case. Deer antlers have a characteristic shape and symmetry between left and right that's characteristic to the species and to the age of the organism. They grow under a felt with blood vessels, and at the end of the season they drop off and the next year they grow again. If the felt gets damaged, sometimes there'll be an ectopic growth, a little side branch that isn't usually there, an asymmetry, an abnormality. And at the end of the season, the antlers drop off and then it grows again. And you think, well, it's going to be fine now because that was just a little bit of historical contingency. It wasn't in the genes that were determining the shape and form of the antler, except next year's antler grows the same abnormality in the same place without damaging the felt. Again, we have a morphological change, which is carried forward, in this case, not to the next generation, but to the next formation of that morphological characteristic. It's very hard to understand how that could be the case if the shape of the antler was determined by genetic information. Here's a third example. If the shape of the pelvis in a quadruped is determined by its genetics, then it ought not to be the case that an organism that has quadruped genes could have a bipedal pelvis. But it turns out that if a goat, for one reason or another, doesn't have any front legs, it can learn to balance on its back legs and walk around. And as it does, as it's developing and growing with that behavior, the shape of the pelvis has characteristics that look much more like a bipedal pelvis than a quadrupedal one. So the shape and form of the pelvis is determined by its usage, not vice versa. There are, of course, many examples of environmentally induced phenotypes that are inherited from one generation to the next. In other words, the idea that there's a gene that determines every physiological characteristic of interest is a fantasy. More generally, the idea that genes determine morphology, behavior, and the way in which an organism interacts with its environment is much more complicated in reality, that there are many cases where morphology, behavior, or environmental interaction modify the genes, or at least the expression of the genes, if not the DNA sequence. We'll come back to that later. But even if it's about modifying the expression of the genes, to turn morphological changes into gene expression patterns that correspond to those morphological changes is quite a bit of reverse engineering, quite a bit of reversibility, even if it doesn't go all the way to the DNA sequence. So here's one example. You take an individual bacterium and you put it on a little pin, on a little column. The column is round and the cell sort of blobs out onto the top of the column in a round way. And you measure the gene expression of the cell in that shape. And then you put it on a square column and it blobs out in a square way, just sitting on top of the column. And you measure the gene expression again and it's different. Isn't it supposed to be the case that the shape of the cell is determined by the genes, not the genes are determined by the shape of the cell? Now, there are, of course, many examples of environmentally induced epigenetics, and it's possible that those epigenetic patterns are, well, they're just like another form of molecular inheritance mechanism like the DNA. They're methyl groups attached to the DNA and they get copied from one generation to the other. The principle is the same. It doesn't really matter whether the heritable material is in the DNA or whether it's in the methyl groups. But here's an interesting case. In Daphnia, the water flea, this is Nathalie Fernier, the epigenetic marks that are induced by a stress environment are wiped out chemically, artificially in the next generation. And then in the following generation, the epigenetic marks reappear. So it isn't that the stress state of the cell is being inherited to the next generation because they've modified the epigenetic marks. The stress state of the cell is being inherited to the next generation anyway. And the stress state of the cell is putting the epigenetics marks back in each generation, even if you wipe them out at intermediate generations. So it isn't just a template copying of the methylation patterns. More generally, it's fair to say the central dogma, the idea that information only flows from genes to phenotypes, is full of holes. There are plenty of mechanisms for information to flow in the other direction. And genome activity isn't just a read process, but it's also a write process. Genome activity isn't just you move along the DNA and you read what's there and you translate and transcribe and translate into protein structure. But there's a dynamic process of reading, writing, reproducing, breaking up, putting back together the DNA material in a dynamic process. Now, more generally, let's look at the multi-scale competence of living systems that occurs without genetic change. One of Mike's favorite examples is the kidney tubule in the newt, which usually has a cross-section of about 8 to 10 cells. But if you make the cells very large, it turns out that the cells curve around and make a circumference with only 4 cells instead of 8. And if you make the cells very large, then one cell curves around onto itself to make a tubule that still has the same diameter, but using only one cell. So these are modifications to cell size that wouldn't have been seen before in evolutionary history. How do the cells know how to create a kidney tubule that's the same size when the cells are themselves a different size? The mechanism of making the tubule in the wild type is a cell adhesion thing. You stick together 8 cells and in a circle and you get a tubule of the right size. But the mechanism in the case where there's only one cell is a curvature in the cytoskeletal structure that causes one cell to bend, a completely different mechanism. Can the same genes be responsible for both ways of creating a tubule? If it hasn't been experienced before in evolutionary history, it isn't reasonable to suppose that this is a general and robust mechanism that was put there for the purposes of coping with cell sizes that were different. In other words, it appears that there is a target morphology that the organismic processes of development will find, regardless of the materials that they're working with, that they can find the same target morphology from by many different means. Here's a different example. In planaria that are treated with barium, the osmotic pressure in the cells around the head causes them to explode and the head melts. Not a technical term. But it turns out that about 15 minutes later, they regrow the head, even though they're still in barium. How the hell did they do that? Well, it turns out that they use a completely different pathway to regulate the osmotic pressure in the cell. Well, that pathway hasn't been needed before because barium is not natural to the environmental conditions of the planarian. So somehow the organism finds a completely different mechanism for doing the same thing that it did before. A different example is reorganizing the organs of the face in the tadpole. If you make a tadpole with the organs in the wrong place, they still metamorphosize into the adult frog with the organs in the right place, even though there can't be genes for moving eyes from the wrong place to the right place because they've never been in the wrong place like that before. Ordinarily, we think of cancer as being caused by mutations in genetic material that make cells go rogue. But it turns out that you can have those genetic mutations but be normal if you modify the intercellular bioelectric communication between the cells that have been genetically modified and the neighboring cells in the tissue that haven't. In other words, they can normalize the carcinogens and the carcinogenic process of tumor development. Likewise, teratogens that cause birth defects in developing embryos can be neutralized by the proximity to other embryos that are developing normally. It's not that the teratogen isn't there or the carcinogen isn't there, it's that its effects can be neutralized or normalized by neighbors who are developing normally. Then there's the various novel collective behaviors of cells from multicellular organisms that are decontextualized and put in another environment. For example, skin cells from the frog that are rolled up into a little ball and put in water, and they swim about like little xenobots. These are behaviors that aren't part of their evolutionary history, but are emergent from the materials of that are orchestrated appropriately in a way that produces reliable outcomes in the original context. Now, it's become a conceptual framework that's sometimes referred to as basal cognition, to mean cognition that doesn't require brains and neurons, but cognition in the sense of living systems with properties normally attributed to cognitive systems, such as memory, learning, and a problem-solving competency. Not because microbes or little worms or plants need to play chess, but because they need to do development. Development requires the ability to adjust and cope with environmental conditions, including ones you've never seen before, because environments are crazy complex, and also to cope with internal failures, because biological materials are pretty noisy that have never been encountered before in evolutionary history. And yet, despite all of those environmental variations and internal variations, you get the same organism, pretty much, or appropriate modifications of the organism if the environment requires it, with the right number of limbs, usually in the right places, and the right organs all connected up in the right way. And to do that requires a problem-solving competency, an ability to adjust to the environment in a problem-solving way, not just programmatically like a lumbering robot, as it were. So that's cognition in the sense of actions that are informed by experience, or knowing in the sense of information integration and collective action. Now, it's worth clarifying here that we're not talking about what's sometimes referred to as higher levels notions of cognition, such as not just being able to do something, but knowing that you're able to do something, knowing that you know, or consciousness. We don't need to go there. We're just talking about systems that do the right thing, where the right thing is solving problems that require taking in information from the environment, integrating it in non-trivial ways, and then using that information to coordinate collective action. Okay, so these three different areas of the theoretical limitations of a self-referential process, the adaptive limitations of a first-order optimization process, and the various observations about the biology bring us to a position where we want to review this story. It isn't just that all of the information is in the genes. Information is acquired and used at many different scales and in many different substrates. There's nested control at all scales. It isn't just bottom-up control. And causation is therefore downwards as well as upwards. All of those processes are reversible, or at least there are processes going in the other direction as well as going upwards. Okay, so it's more complicated than we thought. But one thing's for sure, evolution by natural selection did it. A first-order optimizer did it all. Amazing, right? It organized all of those self-referential feedback loops, the downward causation mechanisms, all of the different ways of acquiring information. They're all adaptations of evolution by natural selection, a first-order optimization process. Yeah, fantastical even. Why are we adhered to that conclusion? Let's sidle up to it a little bit. Notice that natural selection doesn't say anything about what evolves. It doesn't say what organization, what parts or wholes, what structures, what dynamics, what controls, what behaviors, what feedbacks. Save for the assertion that what persists exists, the tautology that we will see more of the things that survive and reproduce, whatever they are, that's all it says. And it doesn't say anything about those things because none of those things matter to how the algorithm of adaptation works. Aside from organismic birth and death and the inherited information that's passed on, mostly in genes, none of it matters to the algorithm, except that those interfering feedbacks probably compromise it or bias it in some way, but that can't be part of the adaptive process. It certainly doesn't enhance it. Natural selection, first-order adaptation, is the prime mover and the only mover in the process. There is therefore no connection between what evolves and how it evolves. So what should we do with all those inconvenient observations? Well, if we observe that it isn't true that all of the heavenly bodies revolve around the Earth, one possible response is to say, well, never mind, we'll just keep those 5 as exceptions. But another response is to suggest that the entire edifice is incorrect. We're not at the center of the universe, and that changes everything about what the universe is and how we fit into it. Hold on a minute. The theory is right. Natural selection is the source of all biological adaptation, isn't it? The heavenly bodies do revolve around the Earth, don't they? How do we know that natural selection is the source of all biological adaptation? Oh, come on. Do we really need to go over this? Let's go over it. Well, the evidence for the tree of life in the fossil record and the molecular evidence for the relatedness of organisms in the tree of life. We know that biological evolution is a fact. Yes, we know that biological evolution has occurred. Did it occur by natural selection? Does natural selection explain all the biological adaptation? Well, there's empirical evidence, direct evidence that natural selection occurs as well. Populations do have entities in them that exhibit heritable variation and reproductive success. The variants do affect their reproductive success, and they do leave more offspring. The inheritance works. What more evidence do you need? Yes, natural selection occurs and biological evolution happened. Does that mean that natural selection was the source of all biological adaptation? Well, really, there's also the logic if you don't like the evidence. It has to be natural selection that did it because the alternative theories don't work. Lamarckian inheritance, for example, doesn't work because even if there is inheritance of acquired characteristics, there won't be any adaptive characteristics to inherit unless there was a directionality And the directionality has to come from somewhere. Presumably it comes from natural selection. Well, just because you don't have an alternative theory doesn't mean there can't be an alternative theory, doesn't mean that your existing theory must be right. Let's dig in deeper. Well, it must be right because it's the only theory that's logically possible. That's universal Darwinism from Dawkins. Exasperated as he does an excellent job of articulating our orthodox understanding of why evolution by natural selection must be true. Rather, evolution by natural selection must be the source of all biological adaptation. But it isn't true that it's the only theory that's logically possible. Learning systems are adaptive mechanisms that don't depend on natural selection. Now, whilst it's popular to explain learning as natural selection in the head, it doesn't have to be. You can do learning as a gradient process just by smoothly modifying the connections between neurons in a directed way. The way that it happens inside real heads is certainly complicated, but you can do it in an artificial system, an artificial neural network, without any natural selection. They're still adaptive. So we know that adaptation can occur in a way that isn't variation and selection. The question is, what kinds of systems can learn? Is it only things like brains and machine learning systems that can learn, that have to be designed or selected for that purpose? Or can learning occur spontaneously? If it could occur spontaneously, then it could be a contender for a different way of explaining how an adaptive process produces biological evolution. Why are we attached to the idea of a selection-first story? Might it be because we understand that natural things can't be clever? The assumption that natural things can't be clever goes a bit like this. Well, the appearance of design is merely apparent. The process is actually entirely unintelligent. It's just what persists exists. Some products of that process are actually intelligent, like us and chimpanzees and perhaps octopus, but they're capable of learning and reasoning and intelligent deliberative action. This is naturally occurring cognition. But all of this naturally occurring cognition, this genuinely clever stuff, that's just another trait of the unintelligent process. It's business as usual. It has nothing to do with how the process works. The process is unintelligent, first-order optimization. And besides, naturally occurring intelligence is too rare to care. It might be the case that humans and chimps and some other special kinds of organisms are intelligent, but if they're the only ones that are intelligent, we can't have a general theory about evolution that's based on cognition if it's so special. So the products of evolution appear like they were created by a cognitive process. They seem clever, but they weren't created by a cognitive process. And they are themselves actually cognitive sometimes, but that's got nothing to do with it. That's a curious disconnect, isn't it? That there's a process that seems to be clever, and the process but isn't apparently clever, and the products of the process are clever, but they didn't have anything to do with the cleverness or the apparent cleverness of the process. It's especially curious when we recognize that cognition is coextensive with life. This is the basal sense of cognition, not just the special organisms with brains and neurons, but all organisms that organize matter in a way that's goal-directed to produce a target morphology are cognitive in the sense of exhibiting basal cognition. If cognition is coextensive with life, it's all the more curious that there's this disconnect between the products and the process. But it can't be a cognitive process. A naturalistic explanation must not presuppose intelligence. That's what we're trying to do without. That's what Darwin was so clever to eliminate. And intelligent systems can't create themselves because that would be circular. So intelligent systems must be a product of an unintelligent process. So the story goes. But do you see the loophole? Natural cognition isn't magic. Why can't it be involved in the process? At least in a bootstrapping way, a system that was a bit informed, by whatever means, could subsequently get involved in modifying the adaptive mechanism in an informed way. Not just a way that makes it arbitrarily biased, but a way that makes it informed. Perhaps, for example, the initial steps along this path were determined by create the products of natural selection. But once they get a little bit clever, they could participate in the process. And because they are themselves, therefore, capable of doing problem solving at the level that's appropriate for their level of organization, that makes them a kind of material that natural selection can act on that's different from acting on an inert material that doesn't have any smarts. Beyond this bootstrapping idea, maybe the product of the process and the process are not even different things. It's not just that we have a process of evolution by natural selection and the products of it interfere with it or modify it or adjust it. It's that there's a process of adaptation and the process produces products, but the products are already part of the process, that they're not even different. Okay, so we looked at these three different types of problems, and they suggest that self-referential, recursive processes are ubiquitous with living systems. They suggest that first-order optimization is a bit weak for doing the kinds of things that are needed. And they suggest that there are lots of inconsistencies in the conventional story about the flow of information upwards only, and the absence of autonomy of the materials, or at least the autonomy of the materials being irrelevant to the process. And those frustrations point the way to a different kind of theory. Perhaps they point the way to a different nature of reality. As Matthew Segal said recently, perhaps they suggest that we should look again at the materialist paradigm and try to understand the universe in a more coherent way so that purpose doesn't need to magically appear somewhere up the hierarchy of complexity, but is somehow driving the process of complexification from the beginning. In this context, I understand purpose to mean purposeful behavior, agential, cognitive, goal-directed behavior, not necessarily in the sense of knowing that you know or conscious, but of the basal cognition kind, doing the informed thing, not knowing what to do, not knowing that you know what to do or being conscious. To look at the relationship between evolution and cognition more carefully, let's look at two different kinds of individual. A Darwinian individual or an evolutionary individual is an entity that's capable of exhibiting heritable variation and reproductive success. An organismic individual is a system capable of exhibiting information integration and collective action characteristic of a self, to use Mike Levin's definitions. Organismic individuality constitutes cognition in a formal sense, whether the causal structures are implemented by neurons or not, whether they're implemented by chemical, gene regulatory, bioelectrical, including neural, ecological or social interactions, hence basal cognition. Now, the conventional story is that evolutionary individuals are need to be presupposed in order to explain organismic individuals. Evolutionary individuality creates cognitive individuals. Cognition is a special case of evolutionary individuality. But a cognition-first view suggests that cognition creates evolutionary individuality, that organismic individuality comes first, and evolutionary individuality capable of reproduction and heritable variation, reproductive success is a special case of organismic individuality. So, bringing this together, what are the aims? Well, a new theory of living things, their origins and their adaptation, a new theory of development of shape and form, a new theory of evolution, adaptation and optimization, and a new theory of cognition, problem-solving, agency, learning, and intelligence, which would account for the reversibility or top-down causation such that organisms can be actors and not just products of the adaptive process, actors in and not just products of the adaptive process. A fundamentally scale invariant process that handles those self-referential feedback loops that are nested at all those different scales, such that causes and adaptation and cognition and agency occurs at all scales, acting downwards as well as upwards. A theory of biological organization and dynamics that explains what evolves, not just it tells us about the part-whole relationships and the dynamic processes that evolve, and not just say something evolves and the things that survive and reproduce you get more of. This will require a sort of entanglement that's a bit like the duality of program and data that we're familiar with in computer science. And all of this needs to start from nothing but physics. Why so grandiose? Why try to do a theory of everything all at once? Well, conventionally, these topics are assumed to be separable. We can talk about development and how organisms work and how genes determine them. We can talk about evolutionary adaptation on a much longer timescale, how variation, selection, and inheritance works on genes. And the genes provide a sort of interface that separate those two topics. And cognition doesn't have anything to do with it. Agency, etc., is just a downstream product of genes anyway and too rare to care. But that kind of separation keeps us stuck in the first-order optimization process, where variation can only occur at the bottom level and everything else is caused by that. And there's no role for the products to influence the process. That's why you have to do everything at once, a theory that turns all of those things inside out and upside down. So a cognition-first theory of life would have to resolve with the conventional understanding of things, including evolution by natural selection. We can't just ignore that. Evolution by natural selection, as we know it, occurs, and biological evolution wouldn't happen without it. Just because something's essential doesn't mean that it explains it. It needs to resolve with those processes that we already know. It also needs to resolve with the fact that phenotypic differences are sometimes genetically determined, or more generally, that there's a pretty strong correlation between the phenotypes of organisms and their genetic makeup. It would need to explain how cognition works. We don't really understand how cognition works, but we're going to have to explain how cognition works if we need a cognition-first theory of life. And I mean proper, clever cognition, not just first-order cognition, not just selection in the head. And we need to explain where cognition comes from, how it originates from nothing, and how cognitive entities can organize physical matter, in other words, solve the mind-body problem. And when we've done that, we'll be finished. It'll be great.